A hearty good morning and warm welcome to everyone at home and their offices. I cannot believe that we are midway through 2022 and it is time for another innate elephant in the room. I'm your host, Michael Summerton. Our aim for this annual event is to help you filter the signal from the noise and equip financial advisors to have confident conversations with their clients. We have gathered a panel of experts across government, economics, and politics who will help us understand the real issues that will influence our trajectory as a country over the medium term. No PowerPoint slides as per usual, just a good conversation. I would like to welcome first Kevin Lings, Chief Economist at Stanlib, and Max de Prieur, author, columnist, and political analyst, both of whom are familiar to our audience at home. Welcome back, gentlemen. It is great to have you with us today.
Thanks, Michael.
I would also like to extend a special welcome to our new guest, to our innate elephant in the room, Dr. Josienso Ramagopa, currently Head of Investment and Infrastructure in the Office of the Presidency. Dr. Ramagopa has previously held the positions of Gauteng MSc for Economic Development, Agriculture and Environment, and was Executive Mayor of the city of Tshwane from 2010 to 2016. A very warm welcome to you, Dr. Ramagopa.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invite.
It's great to have you here today. Before I let my guests get going with their context setting and introductions to their respective topics, if you don't mind, a layman's analogy of where we might find ourselves today. As an avid surfer for many years, one learns that the moon and the tides have an outsized influence on the quality of surf on any given day and can mean the difference between riding the perfect waves or taking a beating with 10 waves in a row on the head. And this is not dissimilar to the ebb and flow of our fledgling democracy. We have years when we make great progress and others where we seem to go backwards while enduring seemingly endless calamities. And like our famous homegrown author J.R.R. Tolkien once wrote in his epic trilogy, The Lord of the Rings, when some unlikely heroes find themselves lost in a very deep, dark wood, pursued by enemies on all fronts and with the fate of their very existence in the balance, the wizard Gandalf appears to them, he himself having endured his own personal journey to the edge of beyond and back and been transfigured. His famous line goes, "Be merry, we meet again at the turn of the tide. A great storm is coming, but the tide has turned." And so we find ourselves once more midway through the year with an opportunity to chat with our esteemed guests about some of the very real headwinds and potentially opportunities which present themselves here at home. I'd like to invite each of Kevin, Max, and Dr. Ramagopa to briefly introduce their context and what they see as some of the key themes to keep an eye on over the short and medium term. Kevin, I think I'll turn to you first.
Sure. Thanks, Michael. Morning, everyone. Hope everyone's staying warm. Being in Johannesburg, it's a little bit chilly this morning. Okay, so from my perspective, South Africa is facing two important dynamics. One is on a cyclical level, in other words, impacting the state of the business cycle, whether we're growing, slowing, etc. And the other is a lot more structural in nature, and that's got to do with our underlying potential growth rate in this country. And I just want to quickly chat about both dynamics. They're both critical right now. From a cyclical perspective, there are actually some positives. I would, off the top of my mind, flag three positives. The one is we've moved past, obviously, the worst of COVID, and we've got rid of all the COVID restrictions, and that's undoubtedly good for economic activity. So you're going to see a benefit to entertainment, to sporting events, conferences, all of those things that have been a little bit restricted in terms of numbers, etc. That should get a benefit as we go into the second half of the year. And particularly as we go into the summer months, generally the summer months towards the end of the year, very positive for entertainment type, sporting type activities. So I think we can't underestimate that uplift to our economy. The second factor is the tax revenue is good, right? So So yes, commodity prices have softened a bit, but the tax revenue is holding up and is expected to hold up. And at this stage, we're probably looking at another tax revenue overrun, and government is in a better fiscal position, not in a fantastic position, but they've got a little bit more free cash. And obviously they're able to control their debt situation better. And we've seen that in the credit rating agencies' assessments of South Africa. And you can get a sense that we're moving closer to the point where they may consider an upgrade. I think it's some way off, but at least it's a more positive stance coming, I guess, from the credit rating agencies. And then the third positive is I think we should expect an improvement in tourism as we go into the second half of the year. I think the message would be out there that it's less restrictive to visit South Africa. We sense that there's a lot of pent-up tourism activity around the world. And I think South Africa would at this stage offer a cheap and attractive destination. And I do think that, I guess, particularly in places like the Western Cape, you're going to go through a bit of a tourism improvement. So those are important positives from a cyclical perspective, and they should help us. Obviously, the big negative remains, and that is essentially inflation and interest rates. Inflation going to go up further. I've got inflation going up above 7% next month. And it's going to stay above 7% for the rest of this year. And there are a couple of problems. One is food. Food prices seem to be accelerating, and I think you're going to see further food inflation, unfortunately. You've also got, obviously, another big petrol price increase expected next month because we've got an under recovery, and we have to get rid of the fuel levy suspension over the next 2 months. So you're going to see another big petrol price increase. And then I think the Reserve Bank will be forced to hike interest rates further. We're saying another 0.5% increase next month, and then increases beyond that, right? And obviously that's the critical factor that will dampen down broader economic activity. And the net result of that is some moderation, some slowdown in South Africa's economy, but hopefully we can cope with it. And hopefully the interest rate hikes from the Reserve Bank are not too damaging. I think consumers are not especially highly indebted. And so I don't think we'll necessarily take significant pain from an increase in interest rates. From a structural point of view, there are some bigger challenges. And a lot of those structural impediments, we see the outcome of that in the unemployment number or the lack of job creation. But a lot of those structural impediments relate to the electricity constraint. This perpetual load shedding is a massive drag on the economy, and it's structural in nature. It's going to take us some time to deal with that effectively. I would add on top of that, obviously, the rail infrastructure, the water infrastructure. There's some key areas there where that's limiting the willingness to invest. It's limiting confidence. It's limiting our ability to export more effectively. It's limiting our ability to employ. And clearly there are plans in place to deal with that, which Dr. Ramakgopa will talk about. But at the moment, it remains a hindrance and a structural impediment to South Africa's growth. So I think we've got to see South Africa in terms of the short-term dynamic, and then talk about how we can start to relieve some of these structural impediments to unlock South Africa's very obvious growth potential. Unfortunately, when you put those two things together and they overlap, they intertwine all the time, it is making South Africa a very challenging economic environment in a global economy that's clearly on the slowdown and under some pressure right now.
Thanks, Kevin. So I was going to go to Max next, just for his brief introduction, but I thought it might be worthwhile turning the mic to Dr. Ramakgopa. You know, having heard what Kevin had to say in his introduction, perhaps you could give us some of your context and maybe comment on one or two of the topics that you've heard raised in Kevin's introduction, and then I'll turn to Max after you.
Thank you very much, Michael, and good morning to everyone and fellow panelists. I must say that I agree entirely with Kevin's articulation. Maybe just to say there are four broad areas that I think should be concerning us, and some of them really present opportunities going into the future. Just the first one is around what Kevin has mentioned on the structural side. I think there are issues related to what I refer to as the imminent collapse of key infrastructure, and I'm referring to water, roads, and of course there are issues around the energy side. But just on the water and roads, we know that our biggest problem really is not on the water resources side. I think there are significant problems on the water services side. So I'm talking to the issues around the reticulation. So you find that municipal water infrastructure is degrading. There hasn't been any significant maintenance over a period of time, and some of it is not designed to meet the current demand, at least to match the rise in population, especially in your key metropolitan areas. And the net result of that has been infrastructure that is failing. So that is water treatment plant, wastewater treatment works. So it's not uncommon that in the country you find sewer flowing down the road. You find significant water leakages. So what we refer to in technical terms as unaccounted for water. So on average, unaccounted for water accounts for about 42% of water losses in the country. So what that means is that a municipality, let's take municipalities in Gauteng, they'll buy bulk water from rainwater. And once it gets into their system and they reticulate it to our taps, they lose 42% of that. So what that means is that it's a revenue that is forgone, and it also depletes, if you like, the water resources. And we know that we are a water deficit country. And then there's issues around the wastewater treatment works. And the capacity of these treatment plants, like I said, is not in a position to meet the growing demand, and a significant proportion of them have not been maintained in the manner that will elongate their lifespan. And the net result of that, like I said earlier on, is sewer that is seen all over. So what we are doing in the office is one, to increase the technical capacity of municipalities to discharge their responsibilities. So we are targeting key metropolitan areas and secondary cities that accounts for the largest part of the water failures in the country. So we've been working with the private sector. The private sector has been able to forward capacity, people with significant amount of skills accumulated over a considerable period of time. So we are setting a special purpose vehicle in the office and essentially troubleshooting these challenges that we are seeing in the country. And then we are revising, if you like, the financing and funding framework in the country to make it possible for us to direct the financial resources towards these challenges. Of course, the major problem there is that the responsibility for reticulation is constitutionally directed, or the constitutional responsibilities of municipalities. So we're creating a mechanism of opting in, because we can't force them to be part of this arrangement. They have to opt in voluntarily. And our experience is that the municipalities, with no exception, are opting into this arrangement to help us to address this situation. And of course, the issue of roads. I am sure a lot of you encounter potholes on your way to work, as you leisure, taking kids to school. And this is across the board, all municipalities. So there is no exception really. And like I said, I mean, the responsibility of fixing and maintaining municipal roads resides with municipalities. But we have taken a view that the government can't stand idle, so national government can't stand idle, especially our office, because we have been designed to make interventions in resolving failing infrastructure. So we have designed a program to just attend to potholes. So of course, some of these pothole failures are structural, and they require the replacement of roads, but a considerable percentage of them are not structural. And our view is that with technology, working with private sector, we can accelerate, if you like, the patching of the potholes, and that will also give us an opportunity to intensify their job opportunities. So it will be labor intensive. So you will see that in some municipalities like Johannesburg, they are already partnering with private sector players. And we think that that should be scaled up at the national level. So there's an existing template. Of course, our interest is to make sure that we attend to those far-flung poor municipalities. That and it is in those areas where there's a penalty that is directed at industries such as agriculture. They are unable to get goods to market, increases the operational cost. And then a subject related to that is the accelerated failures of municipalities. So you would have heard or read the report by the Auditor General. So a significant proportion of municipalities can be classified as dysfunctional, essentially unable to carry out their constitutional mandates. So it's a function of a multiplicity of variables, including the fact that the fiscal matrix of municipalities is deteriorated. So the balance sheet, like I said, is deteriorated. Metropolitan municipalities are unable to raise money in the debt capital markets. Poor municipalities are grant dependent, and when there's a fiscal constraint, we are prioritizing interventions around COVID and providing relief to poor households. It means that we have to redirect money from what would have ordinarily been allocated to municipalities, grant-dependent municipalities, to attend to their daily responsibilities of providing water, fixing roads, and I'm not talking about salaries. So the result of both the objective and subjective factors and some of the externalities that Kevin has shared with us has meant that the municipalities are on the verge of collapse. So this is really outside the issues of governance. That's from a financial point of view. Of course, leadership and governance have got a huge impact on the ability of municipalities to attend to their responsibilities. So one of the areas that we want to intervene in, like I said earlier on, is on the infrastructure side. So we trying to, and now on the verge of just submitting to cabinet a solution on how we can finance infrastructure in municipalities, social infrastructure in particular, working with the pension funds. Of course, there has to be some degree of fiscal commitment going into the future, what we call pledging. So we're exploiting that as an option to allow us the opportunity to access money now to fix the infrastructure that is collapsing, and making a commitment on the fiscals going into the future. Of course, that must be within the realm of the fiscal framework. And maybe just the penultimate point is the issue that Kevin has raised. I think inflation is going to have a significant adverse impact on poor communities. I mean, you know that the poor spend a significant amount of their income just on transport, and we know that the many of the taxi associations across the country are increasing their prices because as a result of the fuel price increase. So there's a very little disposable income that will be left to those poor municipalities, rising levels of unemployment, and can result in significant social discontent. And we have seen the events in July, what can happen in the country. Just imagine that they're spreading across the 9 provinces of the country. Of course, the last time in July when we had significant levels of social discontent, it was isolated to the major metropolitan centers of Johannesburg, and in particular Soweto, Alexander, and then also eThekwini. I mean, just imagine if that were to spread across the country. So that's something that represent, if you like, a national security risk, and it requires urgent attention. Infrastructure will not necessarily be the sole response to that. I'm saying a sole response because the kind of infrastructure that we are designing and the method of delivery seeks to, amongst others, to ensure that there's significant levels of employment. And like I said, we are targeting your far-flung poor municipalities, secondary cities, and major metropolitan centers. And then as the last point, just on the upside, I think there's accelerated levels of investments in the renewable energy space outside the big windows that the DMRE is running, the JET program, and a significant level of interest from private sector players. There's a huge pipeline that ESCOM has produced, and that will be financed through the debt capital markets. We're working with ESCOM to do that on the JET, the just energy transition, and also the issues around green hydrogen. I think there's elevated appetite. I think there's going to be about 2 major projects that will be announced soon, working with our office and private sector. Let me leave it there, Michael, and then I can expand later. Thanks.
Thank you, Doctor. Clearly, investment in infrastructure, not simply in capital investment, but also in skills development at the local level, could significantly enhance, service delivery, where we find a lot of the problems you're describing. So Max, with some of that context, and Kevin and the doctor's points above, what are some of your observations of where we find ourselves from a political standpoint?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I think the title of our meeting this morning is perhaps should be in the plural. There's not one elephant in the room. I think there is, in June 2022, a stampede of elephants in the national room. 2 of the biggest ones, I would say, are the levels of stability in South Africa. And the other one is the position of one Matamela Cyril Ramaphosa. I think we saw during the 8 days in July last year what huge potential there is in South Africa for instability. And that is, since 1994, our biggest asset was we screw up, we stumble, but at least we have basic stability. I think that is now in danger. Now, the stability, the potential for instability is due partly to the factional battles in the ANC, which are becoming vicious beyond control, partly because of the continuing collapse of basic services to especially the poor, and partly due to the growing crisis of poverty, unemployment, and even food insecurity. I see no evidence, unfortunately, whatsoever, that our security forces and our intelligence bodies are in a better position to control such violence than they were last year. And then let me add in the upsurge of xenophobia. It's another indicator of instability, and it is also something that could spark something really ugly. On the other hand, to those of us in the private sector who have been cynical about the emergency social grants to the people, I saw this morning, 51% of South Africa's people rely partly on or fully on social grants. That's a huge number. But when we're cynical about that, just think what our instability situation would have been without any of that kind of aid. President Ramaphosa's position is weaker than at any time since he became the president. His long game, famous long game, and his obsessive focus on party unity have, we know now, failed completely. And his problems with Phala and the strong criticism of Judge Zonda that he did nothing to stop state state capture when he was deputy president had undermined him even more. And in typical Ramaphosa fashion, he said he will only talk about Zonda in October, and he will only talk about Phala after the police investigation. I think that is a serious misreading of the room. I think we need to prepare ourselves for the war on Ramaphosa by his RET opponents to get much, much uglier. The owner of independent newspapers, Iqbal Survey, tweeted yesterday that his publications are about to launch a whole range of exposés of serious corruption against cabinet ministers and top ANC officials. I was reminded what Vatabile Dlamini said years ago, that we all have small skeletons, and if we start outing one, it'll all come tumbling out. Well, it is all come tumbling out. I was surprised to see the apparent nonchalance with which the Ramaphosa inner circle is treating the Phala scandal. And my only explanation is that they have worked out how the president can claim plausible deniability. There are going to be scapegoats, probably Wally Rueda, probably the farm manager, probably some bookkeeper. But the law was clearly broken. And the chances are still there that the Reserve Bank and SARS could make adverse findings. Let me say, I think South Africa is more or less at its lowest ebb. We will muddle on, and we will hope that the ANC conference in December is not a catastrophe. It could be. And in the medium term, we can hope that the coalition government we are most definitely going to get in 2024 will change things around. And by the way, you know, I've been a Cyril Ramaphosa admirer for a very long time. I met him when I was a young reporter, very young reporter on the Financial Mail, and he was a fiery trade unionist trying to put COSATU together. And we're the same age. Sorry, I look a bit older, but I had a hard life. And I have admired his talents, his intelligence, his personality, his honesty. And it pains me to say, especially in the last 2 years, how he has disappointed me in terms of the potential he had as a leader, as a human being, as a mind. And I'm beginning to say, are we so sure that Cyril is the best we have? Do we really have to run to the hills when somebody says he's not going to be our president after December? I'm not so sure. What about people like Minister Thandi Modise? What about a young guy like Ronald Lamola? I think we need to start thinking about that, because this Messiah syndrome we have around Ramaphosa didn't work out for us. I think there is a paralysis of leadership in South Africa that I haven't ever seen in my 40 years in political journalism. But hope springs eternal. I think our energetic and innovative private sector and our very active and very muscular civil society, combined with factors like we are one of the most open societies in the world still. We have free speech, we have an independent judiciary, we have investigative journalists of whom I am deeply proud. Those are our guarantees that a failed state cannot possibly be imminent. And by the way, let's not be so blasé about what has just happened. The report of the Zonda Commission. It is a remarkable moment. It is on a par with our Truth Commission in 1996. There aren't many societies in the world that would have this kind of process, especially the last reports that we saw last week. So lots to talk about. Thank you.
Thanks, Max. That was stirring stuff, and certainly you raised some important points. Perhaps if you've just mentioned Zonda at the end, and a reminder to the audience that we're going to go into some Q&A now and some discussion. Please drop your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. And we will wrap up with the Q&A at the end of the session as well. But just to pick up on, thanks Henk, Fenta sent through a question about Zonda. How does the Zonda report's findings impact the prospects for SA? And do we start seeing large-scale arrests and prosecutions for those implicated? Does this provide some protection for our currency and bonds?
Yeah, I think Zonda, as I said, it's a massive moment. Flawed as it was, late as it was, if you read the entirety of all the reports, 50 years from now, the history books will refer to those findings. The findings, for instance, on Cyril Ramaphosa, who had just appointed Judge Zonda as the Chief Justice, are quite devastating. So there is no doubt about the integrity and the depth of the report. I think it is having an impact on the sort of sense of ethics and morality in our nation. Will there be arrests? Big question. Let's not forget that there are something like 68 corruption cases before the courts at the moment. And you know, Siyabonga Gama, former CEO, is one of them. Ace Magashule is one of them. We have become a bit cynical about that. I think the NPA is picking up speed. Zonda is, in the latest report, recommending criminal charges against about 24 or more people, including some cabinet ministers and former cabinet ministers. The NPA is strained. They are struggling, for instance, with the extradition of the Guptas. But yes, I think we will see, as the Zonda Commission investigators hand over all their files, all their transcripts to the NPA and to the Hawks, we will see that machine slowly grinding. Then the question is, will we see Ramaphosa loyalists like Zizi Kodwa and Gwede Mantashe being charged? Because that will be quite disastrous for President Ramaphosa. But those are some of the recommendations of the Zonda report. I think we need to all, as thinking South Africans, maybe even take a day off or two and actually read these reports, because I find our media are, with some exceptions, are skimming over it. I'm still working my way through most of it and reading it slowly. It is an horrific tale of what went wrong in our society. And is it a reassurance that it will never happen again? Yeah, I think on that scale, it cannot happen again. So hugely significant.
Thanks, Max. And maybe you've touched on a good point there, which is, you know, the decline in the quality of our institutional or our institutions around the country, and how that's impacted on service delivery. And so some of the questions coming through, Dr. Ramakopa, if I could turn to you. So I heard some very good plans from you, some good successes that have happened in the recent years. How can South Africans assist with some of this recovery that you talk about, specifically at the municipal level, and what is your office doing to bring some of this service delivery and make it real on the ground for citizens?
Well, thanks, Michael. I think I do agree that there's a a direct correlation between the quality and delivery of infrastructure and the quality of leadership. And I do agree that the sooner there's stability at the municipal level, provincial and national government level, the better for service delivery. Of course, the issues around the coalition governments are at a very nascent stage in our body politic in the country, and there's some degree of instability because a lot of these coalition governments, their relationship really is transactional. You will allocate these resources to your constituency for as long as you continue to support us, when in fact the conversation should be what is in the best interest of the municipality, what is the agenda, progressive agenda for implementing and delivery that should be bringing these coalitions together. But I guess that with time, they are likely going to mature into solid, if you like, political relationships across the party line, whose sole interest is to ensure that they advance the interest of communities. There has been significant successes in the space of relationship between the private and public sector, and really this was triggered by or induced by COVID-19, what we've come out of a very difficult situation, and it called for greater levels of collaboration between the private and public sector. Let me for a moment just share with you two projects that for me are a significant illustration of what can be achieved if public and private sector were to work together. In the Limpopo area, the mining communities were faced with really an existential question because they need a significant amount of water for them to run their operations. And like I said before, municipalities do not have the financial capacity and muscle to finance the size, the scale of the infrastructure that was required in the area. So what the mining sector did was to engage with our office to say, look, we want to provide the augmentation capacity for their operations, and they are prepared to finance about 57% of the infrastructure financing requirements. And their view was that the fiscal should then inject the remainder, the 43%. Of course, at the time, the legislative framework did not anticipate a situation where there could be such an arrangement. I mean, it's outside your PPP framework. Essentially, this of course is a joint collaboration. The private sector is investing and then matched with fiscal support. But the private sector went further to say, look, we don't think that there exists significant capacity in the state to deliver a project of this magnitude, and the state or public sector is notorious for leakage, essentially not accounting for money that is directed at projects. So we agreed to set up a special purpose vehicle for the purposes of delivering this infrastructure. So the mining communities, they organize themselves under the Lebalelo Water Users Development. Yeah, I think that's the name they call themselves. So we set up an SPV. So we're delivering that infrastructure. The same is happening in the Northern Cape, Valhamahara. Private sector is bringing money to the table. We providing fiscal injection under a special purpose vehicle, and that special purpose vehicle populated by expertise from private sector. Our own expertise has got the governance structure to ensure that there's oversight over how we use the money, the quality of investment, the pace of delivery, and also we put in place a maintenance regime. So the point I'm simply trying to register here is that it is possible for us to work with private sector as long as there's a point of intersection, a common appreciation of infrastructure interventions. The second area is around the provision of technology and skills that can be drawn from infrastructure for purposes of delivering infrastructure. I just read some of the questions on the chat. Some of the participants are saying, but there are skilled people who want to help in these initiatives are not succeeding in providing making available their skills. So one of the problems we have identified in the country especially in the infrastructure space, is a legislative environment. So I'm a civil engineer myself. I'm familiar with many engineers with huge experience that can help in this effort of restoring the infrastructure. But the recruitment process in the public sector is of such a nature that I can't pick up a phone and call Michael with his vast experience. I know you could be standing idle or underutilized to say, come and join the team. Let's deliver this infrastructure. It's not possible. You have to go through this recruitment process, and it could take you up to 12 months to do that recruitment. So part of the interventions we're making in the office is to ensure that we establish a project management office outside the core of government to ensure that we accelerate the recruitment of highly skilled people to help us in the delivery of infrastructure. And the other things about incentives, so how the state is organized, is that there's a ceiling to incentives that can be provided. And of course, these skills that we are looking for are sought after. Some of them are attached to the private sector. So you need to design an incentive arrangement that will make it possible for that sought after skills to come and join us in the delivery of this infrastructure. So we're redesigning that space outside the core. And then the last point on infrastructure is about technology solutions. So some of you might be familiar with some of innovative technologies. I might not be. I'm not familiar with all of them. So people will come to the office and say, this is how we think we can accelerate the delivery of basic infrastructure like schools, what you call RDP houses, government precinct. There's a construction method technology that we can use. It's efficient, it's faster, it's agile, it's got green elements. It makes it possible for us to grow the manufacturing and industrial base. But the law says, the MFA and PFMA says, you have to go through a competitive process for you to get those, the kind of solutions you want. Now, the question we ask is, if something is innovative, and I'm not familiar with that, what that is, I'm not in a position to put together, if you like, a bill of quantities. I'm not in a position to determine what should be the design of that solution, because it's innovative, and by definition, it's something that is new. So the law doesn't make it possible for us to access such technologies. So what we are attempting to do is to advocate for reform. So we have not made considerable progress there, but I'm confident we're likely to get there sooner. And of course, part of the resistance in the state is that the issues that Max was referring to, there's a lot of leakage. There's a lot of, if you like, conduct that undermines, if you like, competitiveness, and therefore the PFMA and the MFMA, the way they are designed is not necessarily to assist in this instance accelerating innovation, but they're designed to catch the crooks. So I'm saying that you can do both. You can encourage innovation, but also ensure that the parameters are so watertight that if there's an intention to do something that is inconsistent with both the law and the letter and the spirit of legislation, we're able to expose those. So we're trying to design those so that we create a situation where innovation can find, if you like, better landing in the public sector space, so that we're able to accelerate the infrastructure delivery. But the net result, the net input I want to make here is that there is opportunities for public and private sector to work together, at least in the infrastructure space, to help us to deliver infrastructure. From a financing point of view, I raised earlier on around access to the pool of liquidity that is sitting with the pension funds, with the necessary guarantees and protection that is required. There's a need for us to generate a pipeline of projects, working with the private sector, the skills that resides there. I spoke about the need for us to redesign, if you like, the recruitment and incentive framework in the public sector, so that a lot of these things are based on merit and professionalism. And then there's issues around addressing leakages in the system. Of course, we know that in some instances when we deliver this infrastructure, the issues around what is characterized as construction mafia. Of course, there are people who go on construction site for purposes of extortion. Those ones should be, the state should be very aggressive and decisive in dealing with them. But there's a large part of it, it's about professionals who want participation in this major infrastructure project. So we are designing those solutions to allow for the gradual or accelerated participation of professionals in that space, so that we get to share the cake. But the experiences of COVID suggest that there's a lot more that can be achieved in private, if private and public sector work together, driven by a common agenda, Michael.
Thanks, Doctor. So I guess, you know, listening to the three of you talk, there's certain headwinds facing certainly our local municipalities from a fiscal perspective, and I see a few questions around debt, and we're going to turn to you shortly, Kevin, and then I'm going to go to Max on coalition politics, because if you just read the lay of the land, you've got many municipalities around the country in dire financial straits. You have a crisis of leadership, and I guess the frustration that South Africans in general feel is like, what are we going to do differently? You know, how do you change the culture of mismanagement, certainly at a local level, to try to bring some service delivery? And we have grand plans, but what are we going to change differently? So, but maybe just to Kevin first, at a macro level, from a debt perspective, we're certainly not like a first world country, but for South Africa in terms of debt to GDP, what's the impact of ours going forward?
Thanks, Michael. I think that the debt situation for government looks slightly better than it did a couple of years ago. It wasn't that long ago we were worried that government debt would go to 90% of GDP. There were even estimates of it going to 100%, that South Africa would need substantial IMF support and some sort of major bailout. And all of that simply didn't materialize. And part of it has to do with the National Treasury trying to reinstate fiscal discipline. Part of it has to do, obviously, with the recent tax revenue overrun last year of 180 odd billion rand. And to its credit, government used half of that to reduce debt. So our fiscal position now is better. It's still not at a point where you would brag about it. It's not at a point where government could say, well, we're going on a significant infrastructure building program using government debt. That's just not feasible. And obviously, at a state-owned enterprise level, those balance sheets are not in any way able to support significant infrastructure expansion. So the fiscal position remains an overarching constraint. Now, there is quite a lot of sympathy for governments taking on additional debt if that money is being channeled directly to infrastructure and therefore growth enhancing investment and employment generating investment. And the World Bank would certainly support that and has supported that. And we could obtain additional funding at good rates from the World Bank. But it's not as if we can simply go on a huge spending spree at a government level and just take on ever greater levels of debt in order to fund infrastructure. So when you do the maths, you realize that private-public partnerships are really the only way to progress here. In other words, use the private sector's balance sheet, leverage that, deal with cash flow implications for government, and see if you can't structure a deal to get the infrastructure done. And then hopefully that infrastructure generates more economic activity, more employment, and then in turn, more tax revenue. And I think there's a huge amount that we could still do around private-public partnerships. I think most sectors could benefit from that. I can't see why you can't have it in whether it's in ports, whether it's in rail, road, sanitation, water. I think you can use private-public partnerships in most of these areas. our discussions with pension funds, with investors, is there's a lot of appetite for this type of initiative, and there has been money allocated, and more money is available to be allocated. The restriction tends to be viable projects, is where you've got a project that is being scoped, that is ready to be implemented, and there's a deal on the table that you can take to the private sector and say, here's the deal, invest in this, and you know where the parameters are. I think the money is available. So to me, that's very encouraging, and it should allow for the government to maintain a decent level of fiscal discipline, manage their cash flow, and try and get the infrastructure done, and then hope that the confidence builds on the back of that. The key thing here is to get the catalyst. You need a catalyst, a visible catalyst for growth. It has to be visible. You can't do these infrastructure projects and nobody knows about it. It's not going to have the desired effect. If you go back to the Soccer World Cup, what provided a huge amount of support then was that people could see the stadiums being built. You could see the visible renewal of various areas. And it's that visualization that then leads to a furthering of confidence. So it's about making a visible impact. And just to go back to one of Max's points around corruption, you need the same thing. It's all very well that there are 80 odd corruption cases, but you need visible prosecution that leads to jail time. Otherwise, it doesn't have the desired effect. You're not going to get that lifting confidence. And it's that element that is missing, where people say, how's it going to be different? I think the reality is, behind the scenes, there's quite a lot happening and there's a lot of progress being made. It's just not visible enough. And I think we need to focus on a couple of key projects that create a visual and a visible impact that then inspires confidence and says, hold on, look, there is something happening. Thanks,
Kevin. Before I get to Max on coalition politics, I'm just conscious that the doctor has to leave us at 10:30. So I wanted to just ask Dr. Ramakorpa to comment on because the obvious place for renewal in terms of big budget spend would be our rail and ports. Taking trucks off the road between Durban and Joburg seems to be an obvious thing, and investing in large scale infrastructure. And I guess over time we've let our ports and rails atrophy. What can be done to bring some more efficiencies to those rail and port capabilities?
Thanks, Michael. So we have just approved what we call the National Infrastructure Plan 2050, and that had gone through extensive public participation exercise. So what the plan does, of course, like the name says, articulates the kind of infrastructure that will help us to deliver the plans that are in the National Development Plan. Of course, the horizon of the NDP is 2030, but we know that on many indices of those targets, we're missing the mark. Essentially, we're far off the target. But we also say in that the National Infrastructure Plan, what is it that has to be done immediately? So immediately is now, and the next 3 years. We're targeting there 4 foundational network infrastructure sectors: energy, water, transport. And on transport, the focus is on freight transport and also ICT infrastructure. So on freight transport, we have the following to say, is that a significant amount of goods are transported by road, and that has got significant inefficiencies. So first is that our roads are not designed to carry the amount of traffic that we are seeing now. But also there's a huge congestions once you get to the port of Durban, one of the biggest ports in the country. So you need staging facilities. If you had to go to Durban and the areas next to the ports, I mean, the queues of trucks in West instances, they could go up to 8 kilometers. So it stifles, if you like, movement and mobility in eThekwini. And by our calculation for agriculture, for an example, 80% of the produce is transported by road and 20% by rail. So what we are advocating for is for us to flip that split, that 80% should be by freight and just 20% by rail. And then the next question is, how do you make that possible? And in fact, it answers the question, why in the first place do you have an equation that is largely in favor of road-based transportation as opposed to rail, like many of some of the attendants are saying, is because of the failure of the road infrastructure. So you know that there's reforms that are being proposed, that the possibility of introducing third-party operators, so essentially concessioning some of the Transnet line to allow third-party operators to come on board. So that's more on the reform side. And then there's also interventions in relation to making the Durban port more efficient, and in fact, bringing other players to come into the operations of the Durban port. And I'm sure that you are familiar that Transnet is undergoing that exercise. Then you need to protect the existing infrastructure. I mean, even commuter rail, its potential and efficiency has been undermined because of the distraction that has happened there, both the actual rail infrastructure, the tracks themselves, and also the rail stations. So PRASA is undergoing that exercise. First is that they protect the line, and then working with us is to bring investors into bringing their money to help to develop, if you like, the stations. We see the stations as economic activities that are anchored on rail transport. So just moving away from just the narrow definition of a rail station, essentially just being a throughput of commuters catching a train and on also alighting and getting into taxis. But we see that as an economic node, as a functional economic node, and there has to be integrated development. So just a rethink of that. And our view is that it shouldn't be PRASA that is focused on that. PRASA should be focused on the efficient operation of commuter transport and the protection of the asset, and allow private sector through long-term leasing for them to develop station precinct. Like I said, I mean, once you concession some of the rail lines, I'm sure private sector will bring both their expertise and financing to ensure that we are able to develop this. But again, this thing operates as a network. So the network has to be efficient. So you also have to address the bottlenecks at the Durban port as an example. And I did make the point that there's an intention by Transnet to ensure that we get the private sector operators in that space. And of course, if it's not road-based, I think we are likely going to achieve the kind of efficiencies that are required there. And of course, using modern technology to load some of the containers onto the ship and also to retrieve them from the ships. And then there's a whole issue of skills. I think it's important that we have to have an unwavering commitment to recruiting the best in the sector to help the public sector to discharge its responsibilities. Of course, that must be accompanied by an agenda to ensure that the skills are passed on to younger people to come into the space so that we broaden the skill space in the country and we continue to be competitive. Again, I return to the point I made earlier on, that the solution to South Africa's problem relies on the relationship, coordination, and communion that the private sector are likely going to strike going forward. Kevin makes reference to 2010. So a few things were present when we delivered infrastructure in 2010. One is that we had some of the world's most renowned infrastructure construction companies in the country, some of the most leading in the world. Of course, much later we realized that there were issues of collusion, but essentially skills that resided in the country, and government tapped on those skills to deliver the infrastructure. Secondly was the speed of procurement. I mean, just recently, we've been working with Sandral over the past 2 years to deliver a pipeline of roads projects to the tune of 17 billion rand, raise money in the debt capital market. And then 2 years into the procurement process, then suddenly they canned the project and we must restart again. So that undermines the investor confidence, but also stifles, if you like, growth and the revitalization of the secondary industries of construction and manufacturing. So you need to address the procurement environment. Of course, we must undermine leakage, but it must be fast so that we need to get the right people and the right construction companies into place. Yes, so I'm just saying 2010, excellent example. We need to go back to learn from those examples, but issues of skills, revitalization of the construction sector. So there has to be a pipeline, there has to be see-through so that the increased capacity utilization, and then there's issues around the procurement, the speed, undermine the leakage, get the right skills in place and allow the private sector to deliver that project. And I think as the public sector, we need to create that environment. Of course, the state must lead, determine where development is going, but I think working together, we are likely going to achieve a whole lot more in the infrastructure space, restore, if you like, the credibility of our infrastructure build program and solidify and strengthen the skills at the municipal level. It's going to take time, but a bit more gradual, but I think we must be deliberate and intentional in our interventions, especially just targeting secondary municipalities or metros first, secondary municipalities, and those municipalities that can undermine delivery in our country. And the rest will come, and you have over 250 municipalities. It will be a height of folly to suggest that you can make interventions at the right or simultaneously across all these municipalities. I think there has to be a science in how you prioritize. And we have proposed to Cabinet how best we can do that. And I did say that we are already on the go in addressing some of those weaknesses in municipalities, Kevin.
Thank you, Doctor. And if you do need to drop off, feel free to. Thank you so much for your time this morning. It's been very insightful hearing some of your plans, and we look forward to seeing some real results, because I think that real achievable results can make a massive difference to this country.
Thank you.
Max, I'm going to turn to you with the specter of coalition politics. You know, we've seen some spectacular failures. My hometown of Gqeberha, formerly Port Elizabeth, you know, it's been hamstrung by coalitions. And then we've seen some marginal successes elsewhere. It's new territory for our country in terms of coalitions. And maybe you could, you know, give us some thoughts on how you see things progressing at a national level and potentially at a local one as well.
Thank you, Michael. Just a wave to my friend Andre de Ruyter. I'm sitting in the dark and I've just been load shed. So thank you, Andre. We're thinking of you. A quick other thought, if you allow me, Michael. Listening to Dr. Ramakgopa, I am reminded that the stable of the state is not entirely empty of talent. I've said to some of you before that I think Enoch Godongwana is the best finance minister we've had since Trevor Manuel. He truly is, known him a long time, he is a treasure for us. If you look at the leadership at SARS, if you look at the leadership at Treasury, you just think, why can't we have that kind of quality of leadership in other departments? And then we wouldn't be talking so negatively about our society. Let's get to coalition politics. The advantage that we have of these experiments in local governments, especially in the metros, is that we're learning how to do it in 2024. Because, I mean, I would bet my bottom dollar that the ANC is going to come in under 50% in the general election. Big question, though, is, will it be 47? Because then as we've seen in some of the local governments, the ANC can pick one or two tiny parties and make up their 50%. I personally hope it's going to go closer to 40%, where the ANC will be forced to involve the Democratic Alliance and Action SA and the Inkatha Freedom Party, or two of the three of them. I think there's a lot of thought going into what should change before we can make coalitions work, like they work in Germany. And some of our parliamentarians have recently been on a study tour to Germany to study exactly that. I know in the DA, there's some serious thinking going on. I know Athol Trollip and Bongani Baloyi at Action SA have been thinking about it. They have a bit of a problem with their leader, Mr. Mashaba, who is a bit of a bull in a china shop when it comes to these kind of coalition agreements. What is clear is that when we get to 2024, on provincial governments and on national government, is that there will have to be very clear agreements between the parties. It has to be a sophisticated document that is signed by everybody. So you won't have what you had in Gqeberha, where the EFF and UDM can just upset the apple cart because they feel like it in the morning, and the whole administration is thrown into turmoil. So that's the one thing. But I think the closer we get to 2024, the problem for political parties is political contestation will be hotter. The DA is thinking they can get close to 30%. Action SA thinks they can get to 20%. The EFF thinks they can get to 20%. When they all look at the wounded animal in the corner, the ANC. So that makes it harder, because the hotter the contestation, the greater the friction, the higher the levels of rhetoric. But I do think there is a maturity in some of these parties to think we got to keep up the back channels. Steenhuisen has to talk to Mashaba, even though they shout at each other in public. And I see some of that going on. I think it's crucial. I live in Cape Town. And when we're talking about a failing state, I'm looking out of my window. I live virtually in the first world. The administration of the city of Cape Town and the Western Cape Province is exceptional. It's exceptional. There is nothing where I live that I would want to change. I have a feeling that it's important that the DA should be part of that coalition in 2024. But it will have to undergo a change in style, not in substance, not in policy, not in the talent that they have. They have to learn a new style of getting along with fragile egos. They have to stop the exodus of Black leadership from the DA at all costs. All those things will strengthen the DA. I think South Africa will be stronger, much stronger, if the DA is a senior partner in a coalition government. Action SA is the dark horse. We don't know where they're going to go. It looks like they could go up to 15 to 20% of the support. But they need to establish themselves in every out corner of the country and build branches, which is why Athol Trollip is such a huge asset to them, because that's what he does best. And they have a guy, the former mayor of Midvaal, Bongani Baloyi, who is hot political property. He's strong, he's good, he's young, he's energetic. So don't throw away the Inkatha Freedom Party as a partner. It's survived against predictions that once Chief Buthelezi is sort of fading in the background because of age, they will die off. It is pretty vibrant, And we have a problem in KwaZulu-Natal. The Free State and Eastern Cape are our weakest governed provinces, but KZN is the most volatile. And we've seen the whole provincial government going the RET way. They just went last week to Jacob Zuma to sit at Nkandla at his feet. I mean, for Pete's sake. So we need the IFP as a stabilizing factor there, and to bring in the EFF. I think we've seen now in Parliament is not growing up. Their brand of theatre politics is not working in South Africa. I don't see them ever breaking the 15% ceiling. And that makes it, the question is very serious. If the ANC goes into coalition with the EFF in 2024, I will ask for political asylum in Mariupol. I think it is extremely important from a stability and economic point of view to keep the EFF out of a coalition with the ANC. But that means the DA, Action S and IFP should reposition themselves to be the ideal candidates.
So what's going to stop them, Max? I mean, it seems an easy deal, right? Offer up your 15% for a disproportionate influence on power.
Yeah, and quickly also, remember, we will have a completely different electoral system in 2024. We might even have a directly elected president, which is what Judge Zonda is proposing. But the Constitutional Court has ordered Parliament to change the electoral system to allow for independent candidates, for instance. And so we recently saw the former editor of Business Day, Songezo Zibi, announcing that he will stand for president. We see people like Musi Maimane mobilizing independent candidates. So it's all very exciting in the sense that it breaks the mold that we used to of the last 28 years. But DA, I think it has a crucial role to play, but it has to change its approach. It has to stem the tide of virtually every talented Black leader leaving. Why are they leaving? And they're leaving for Action SA with a similar policy. So it's not a policy problem. It is a political culture problem. And dare I say it, I think my dear old friend and colleague, Ms. Helen Ziller, has a part in that. She is not a natural coalition partner. She is too strident. She doesn't read the room, and people experience her as arrogant. John Steenhuisen has been a bit in a shadow. So we got 2 years. The DA needs to wake up. They have everything in terms of a record of governance to be a senior partner. We need them to be a senior partner. And the same goes for Action SA.
Max, you've always told it like it is, and that was some of the best points I've heard from you. Kevin, you've also been very forthright around policy change in South Africa, and you've had your top 10 things that you would do in the next few months to change and have significantly different outcomes. One, perhaps you could touch on that, but also something that's been completely vacant is the role of corporate South Africa. You know, I'm sure many of them have had their AGMs this year, but you see them, nobody sticks their head up above the parapet. And you know, that's what sort of role would you hope for corporate SA, both, you know, large listed companies and small and medium enterprises?
Michael, I think it's absolutely critical that big business plays a bigger role. And I am critical of the role they currently play. So they would be represented at NEDLAG, and they have discussions with government and trade unions around policy. But it ends up being, quite frankly, very polite discussions. It's not particularly assertive. It doesn't really move the dial in terms of taking South Africa forward. When you look at the financial strength of South African courts, it's very significant. The balance sheets are good, and they're good by global standards. We keep referring to cash on hand, but it's not just cash. Corporates tend to have fairly low debt levels. They tend to be conservative in how they take on or expand their balance sheet. And so they are in a position to make a difference financially. And they've also got a good skills base and a good track record in how those businesses are managed. And so you would want them to play a much, much bigger role in taking the country forward, partly because they stand to lose a huge amount. And certainly the workforce within South African business stands to lose a huge amount. Small business doesn't have a voice in South Africa, and that's very unfortunate. And I think it's vibrant depending on the city you go to. Western Cape, I would say it's especially vibrant, small, medium business, but it tends to not have a voice. It's not represented in places like NEDLAG. It doesn't get the sort of airtime. It doesn't get to influence policy a huge amount. And I think government talks about policy in favoring small business almost as an afterthought. It's not really a clear, purposeful endeavor by government. So what you would want is for business collectively to flex their muscle, to have much bigger influence on the outcome of policy, and most importantly, on the implementation and the speed of implementation. Now, you can see some of that coming about with the energy sector, where the private sector is stepping in out of necessity and taking on energy projects that help their own business, etc. But I would want to see them much greater involvement. I would also think there's a lot of merit in private sector going to government and saying we are willing to invest in infrastructure, because private-public partnerships are now being endorsed by government, which is good. But every time I listen to government, they keep saying, yes, but if private sector wants to invest, it's not if. Private sector wants to invest. They need to invest. They know that, and there is available funds. I think they need to make that directly a lot clearer, that money is available, and perhaps even a system of pooling some of those funds to make those projects more substantial. The last thing on business is I would say that we lack what I call mavericks, people who invest when others are running away. And you don't need a lot of them in your country, but you need some of them. And yes, there can be controversial figures like an Elon Musk, and they can say things that are out of turn, etc. But they create an important dynamic in the business world, and they show leadership. They show that they're willing to take risk where others aren't. And I think that we lack that in South Africa's corporate world. We tend to be very conservative. Balance sheets are very conservative. We want everything to be neatly in place. And I keep saying South Africa is a messy emerging market, and it will remain a messy emerging market. And I worry that South African corporates are only going to invest when they open the door and they see Switzerland. In other words, they want to see an environment outside their house that looks absolutely pristine. And when everything is in place, then they'll consider investing. That's not going to happen. This is an emerging market. This is a messy emerging market. The politics are always going to be messy. The roads, the rail is always going to be messy. You hope it gets better. But you've got to find a way to make your business work in this environment, not an environment that you hope someday perhaps materializes. And I think that element is not there. That element of this is the reality we're facing. How do we make this work for ourselves? And then they become part of the solution. So to me, the only way forward, Jason, I spend a lot of time thinking about what are the options for South Africa to grow the country. And you could say things like tourism and agro processing, but ultimately this has to be done through partnership. It has to be private sector joining with government to get things done. I just don't see government moving ahead quick enough, emphatically enough on their own. They don't have the balance sheet. I don't think they have the sense of urgency that's required to move this all along at a pace that will make a difference. I don't think we have time, as Max was saying. Instability is a real threat in this country, and I don't think time's on our side, which tells me there must be a greater role for private sector. And I think part of it is also explaining to government why this is a win for them. In other words, let's say that private sector gets involved in water distribution in a municipality and it's successful. Government can claim all of that as their own, right? Mm. The private sector is not interested in accolades around that. The private sector wants the work, it wants the investment, and it wants it to work. The government can claim, well, we got this done for the benefit of the population in that municipality, and we managed to deliver this, therefore, we're expecting votes, and I think they'll get those votes. So there's an upside for government if private sector gets more involved, and it's convincing government that the partnership is good for them, not just good for the population, not just good for employment, not just good for economic growth and tax revenue, but for their political ambitions, which seems to govern a lot of what they're about. So I think that case needs to be made a lot stronger. And then I think we can become a lot more optimistic. The base level is incredibly low. Just getting a couple of things right, geez, it will make a big difference. You'll get that growth rate picking up off that low level very substantially, and suddenly it will feel like a different country. It doesn't take that much, but you got to find that inflection point, that turning point, and we're not there. We're not there yet. I was listening to before this talk. I was listening to the news, and they were saying, and this Max will be able to comment on this. They said this on the news, right? That political assassinations are on the rise in KwaZulu-Natal, and in my head, I'm thinking, okay, so we've got a base level of political assassinations, and now they're on the rise. Why do we have a base level of political assassinations? It is a bizarre thing to contemplate that we monitor whether these things are on the rise or not. So we've got that level of instability that could come back. It's not far away, and it's a real risk. So I don't think we have time on our side to start to make a difference.
Sure. So thanks, Kevin. That felt like a really great close from you. So I'm not going to press you for any more detail. But maybe just to tie the two together, Max. So Kevin was talking about, when it came to corporate SA, like a level of pragmatism in order to invest your capital. It's never perfect. So at some point you have to take on some risk. And I guess I would turn that around to government and say, well, you have some ideological stances on many issues. For example, very centrist planning, lots of regulation in place. And at some point, factors like civil insurrection, debt to GDP, etc., surely that must bring some pragmatism to government's choices going forward. And the threat of coalition politics perhaps could stir some change in some of those long-held ideologies. Max, do you want to comment on that and just close out with some last thoughts?
Yes, thank you, Michael. By the way, we're going to get stage 6.
We've seen lots of those comments in the chat box as well.
Load shedding. I just saw the announcement, stage 6 from tonight. It's horrific. Yes, I think that is entirely correct. And by the way, I thought Kevin was brilliant in what he said in his last piece, and I applaud every word. I think that's exactly it. I think that realization that government, that the state needs the private sector, is already there. And we listened to some of what Dr. Ramakgopa said. We listened to the stuff that Ino Godongwana is saying. His replacement, Godongwana's replacement as head of the economics desk at the ANC, is Mamaloko Kubai. And she made very strong statements last week that goes directly against ANC orthodoxy, the old national democratic revolution kind of thing. So that it's not that they want to, it is that they know the country will collapse if they do not do it. The ANC cannot govern this country on their own. And they're beginning to realize that. So now we need to move those pieces into place. But formal policy from the National Executive Committee of the ANC, from the President, from the Finance Minister, is that we are going to privatize, semi-privatize, and public-private partnerships. And I think that is, of course, as Kevin said, that's the way to go. Because if you want to feel hopeful in this country, you have to look at the humongous gulf between the private sector in South Africa, which is vibrant, energetic, innovative. I mean, talk about Naspers, Capitec, Clicks, all Remgra, all these companies that are quite remarkable. And then you look at a state that is sort of struggling just to cope. And you look at our civil society, you look at our universities, you look at the bright people we have. And so at some point, that gulf has to narrow, and it will narrow when the ruling party gets weaker and civil society and the private sector plays more of a role. And I think that is as it is Kevin's, it's my big hope that that's where we're going. We can't collapse much further than we have. On a small scale, we're seeing this happen. I come from the illustrious metro of Kroonstad in the Free State, which, as we say in Afrikaans, is maar 'n kakdorp, jong. And suddenly I go to Kroonstad and it looks completely different from the last time I was there. And the local AfriForum, Freedom Front, and DA had combined with the Communist Party and the ANC in Kroonstad, and they fixed that place. Not the municipality, not the province, not the government, the people. So that's where it starts and it gets bigger. We can't lose all hope.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Max. And I'm going to bring it to a close there. Thank you to all three of our guests and also to our audience for their kind attention and questions. We thoroughly enjoyed hearing from all of you this morning. A sobering tour of our current context, but hopefully a balanced view and one that has equipped our audience to have confident conversations with their clients going forward. And that brings us to the end of our 2022 innate elephant in the room, or as Max said, elephant stampeding through the room. Have a great day further.
Innate is a registered trademark of Stanlib Wealth Management Pty Limited, an authorized financial services provider.